Hi, everybody. This is Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick, and you're in the company of fellow gearheads worldwide in places like San Antonio, Texas, Denver, Colorado, Guelph, Ontario, Canada, Nagoya, Japan, Fayum, Egypt, and Stockholm, Sweden. Thanks for joining me once again, and I'm a little late with the episode this week because my schedule has been kind of crazy, but better late than never. And this time I've got a bit of a different episode for you. I think you'll agree that we probably all spend far too much time on Facebook Marketplace and Bring a Trailer and such, and we're just looking for cars and parts, right? So I thought it'd be fun to think of a few different cars that I'm interested in and sort of assemble a virtual car collection. And the only rule I gave myself was basically to stay on a reasonable budget, which is harder than you might think if you don't surf the internet all the time for cars, because the trade-off is that often when you find what looks like a deal, you end up spending a lot more in the long run to sort things out. Most of the time, a cheap fixer-upper will nickel and dime you to death. So as we go along, keep the market realities in mind. I'm not going for bargain basement here. And the other thing is that most people overprice cars online, especially on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace. And when it comes to auctions, the competition can be fierce. We'll also talk about some history on each car, because you know how much I like to do that. It adds context, and once you know the history, you appreciate a car even more. All right, so with that, here's my budget virtual car collection, starting with the Ford Model A. With his groundbreaking Model T, Henry Ford put more Americans behind the wheel of their first automobile than any other car maker in history. In an era when paved roads were still uncommon and long-distance travel by rail was about the only option, the Model T must have seemed heaven-sent. It was rugged, affordable, reliable, and easy to maintain. In 1924, the 10 millionth Ford rolled off the assembly line in Highland Park, Michigan. By that time, incredibly, half the automobiles in the world were Model Ts. In fact, 15 million of them were built from 1908 to 1927. But by the end of the run, the Model T was well past its market peak. So Ford urgently needed an all-new car. And Henry's son Edsel was instrumental in convincing his father to start fresh. The result was the Model A, a far more sophisticated machine in every way. It had a stamped steel body, safety glass, a larger and more powerful 201 cubic inch four-cylinder engine, and a conventional sliding gear transmission, unlike the bizarre planetary thing that was in the Model T. And it had four-wheel drum brakes, a big change from the Model T, which had a foot-operated driveline brake instead. So you would step on the pedal, but the brake would actually activate on the driveline and not at the wheels. All these features necessitated a long list of new manufacturing processes and improvements in the assembly line. Ford was a vertically integrated company, meaning it was not dependent on outside suppliers. Instead, they owned the entire supply chain from raw materials to finished components. About the only thing Ford didn't make themselves were the tires, which mostly came from the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. And Henry Ford and Harvey Firestone were very good friends, and in fact, the families intermarried later on. There were many advantages to vertical integration, but it also meant the transition from building the Model T to the Model A was risky, because it represented a massive capital expenditure and engineering changes across several dozen assembly plants worldwide. Ford had the cash flow, but if there were delays, technical problems, or worst of all, the new car didn't sell well, the whole project could spell disaster. Fortunately, they pulled it off. A huge industrial undertaking, and the Model A became a sensation when it was introduced in late 1927. Over the full production run, there were a dizzying number of ways you could order your very own. According to the Model A Ford Club of America, there were 52 different body styles depending on trim level, either standard or deluxe. From coupes and roadsters to four-door sedans, Phaetons, and even roadster pickups, and of course, the wooden-bodied station wagon. Nearly 5 million Model A's were built from 1927 to 1932. And although that's only a third of the number of Model T's that had been built, it wasn't a reflection of the car itself. Instead, it was because by that time, there was far more competition in the marketplace, and because the Great Depression had a severe impact on new car sales, which declined by 75% in the early 1930s. But if you watch old film clips from the 30s and 40s and even beyond, you're guaranteed to see numerous Model A's. It was such a good car and so popular that they survived in huge numbers. And over the decades, they've been handed down in families and hopped up by hot rodders and perfectly restored by collectors. In fact, the Model A became the backbone of the old car hobby in the U.S. in the 1950s. They're easy to drive as long as you figure out how to double clutch because it's a crash gearbox. There are no synchronizing rings in there. And from a standing start, what you do is accelerate to about 15 miles per hour, push in the clutch pedal, shift to neutral, let the clutch out, push it again, gently shift into second gear, and then let the clutch out once more. Then repeat that process into third gear around 30 miles per hour, and you're done. You're in top gear. When it's time to downshift, the process is the same, except you have to blip the throttle just before you throw the lever. The flathead four-cylinder engine in the Model A makes about 40 horsepower, and it doesn't like to rev, which is important because these engines had Babbitt bearings, and the crankshaft has no counterweights. But it is torquey, and it's happiest when you're cruising at about 35 or 40. The mechanical brakes are adequate, as long as they're properly adjusted and you keep a safe distance from the car in front of you. Theoretically, you could drive one daily if you lived in a small town and you don't have a lot of hills to deal with. It's a simple pleasure to drive a Model A, and you get lots of waves and thumbs up wherever you go. Now, values have been falling for these cars, especially if it's a four-door sedan, although open cars and pickups still carry a premium because of the hot rod factor. You can still find fairly original examples out there, but lots of Model A's have been modified in questionable ways, so it pays to shop around. Over on Facebook Marketplace, you can find a scruffy Model A project for $3,000 to $5,000. They're very simple to work on, and reproduction parts availability is excellent, but try to get the most complete example you can. Old original Ford parts are still the best. And don't let surface rust and faded paint bother you, because the right patina on these cars is a good thing. You can get in the door with a clean driver at around $12,000 to $15,000, but that should buy you a sorted car with minor imperfections. Maybe an older restoration. And if it's been restored, that's okay. Most of them have. Just try to find the most period-correct car for your budget. Avoid anything with significant mechanical changes like an engine swap, or fiberglass fenders or aftermarket seats from some Camaro, and also weird interior parts. Forget about that stuff. You want it to look period after all. It's almost easier sometimes to start out with a scruffy original car than it is to fix someone else's weird modifications. For the most part, Ford painted these cars in earth tones, ranging from black to light tan. There were also some very attractive blues and greens, and fenders were usually black. Model A's were not flashy, so brightly colored paint is a sure sign the car has been fluffed up. 1930 and 31 are the most desirable model years because they have a few refinements and a little more style, but the earlier cars have charm too. It really comes down to your personal opinion on the aesthetics. The Ford Model A Club of America is very active with 250 local chapters and about 10,000 members worldwide, and they publish a monthly magazine. So there's plenty of support from other owners. And scores of books and technical restoration guides have been published to help you improve and maintain these cars. There are probably tens of thousands that are still roadworthy. So if you want a pre-war car, the Ford Model A is, in my opinion, the best choice when you consider price, parts availability, technical support, and historical significance. They're easy to drive and a whole lot of fun. Next, we jump ahead to the 1950s, when V8 power and acres of chrome became symbols of American post-war prosperity and industrial might. But I think a big boulevard cruiser would be a far too obvious pick for the next car, and all that chrome and stainless trim costs a small fortune to restore. I don't even want to think about it. On the other hand, the 1950s was also the decade of the sports car craze. There are many to choose from. The Jaguar XK120, the Corvette, the Porsche 356, the Austin Healey 3000, and the list goes on. But we need to think affordable. You don't have to spend $100,000 to have fun. Even in the period, there were sports cars for the average guy, and one of the prettiest and most popular was the Triumph TR3. Triumph began as a bicycle manufacturer in 1885 and made its first motorcycle in 1902. In World War I, thousands of Triumph motorcycles were used by the Allied forces, and in the 1930s, their bikes gained a reputation for speed and sturdiness, especially with the 500cc Speed Twin. Triumph began building low-priced cars in the 1920s, but it never really found its place in that market, and in the mid-1930s, the motorcycle side of the business was sold off to raise cash. By 1939, the Triumph Motor Company was in bankruptcy. Its remaining assets were acquired by the Standard Motor Company after World War II, which revived the Triumph nameplate with a new sports car in 1953, the Triumph TR2. It was aimed primarily at the U.S. market as a competitor to Jaguar and MG, both of which had already become very popular with American buyers. And this was at a time when Britain was still recovering from the war and their mantra was export or die. So American customers had money to spend. And the secret to Triumph's new machine was its simple design and parts bin mechanicals borrowed from Standard's other models. By the way, Standard made some incredibly boring cars, and they needed a big hit for export. The TR2 had a conventional ladder chassis, independent front suspension, leaf spring rear with a live axle, and knee action lever shocks. And under the bonnet was a 4-cylinder pushrod engine of 2 liters, which was originally designed in part to power Ferguson tractors, which was another Standard product. So although it wasn't high revving or fancy, it was torquey and reliable. Backing it up was a 4-speed manual gearbox with an optional electric overdrive that could be engaged with the push of a button. The whole thing was wrapped in a streamlined 2-seater body with swooping mud guards and cut-down doors, which from the side made the car look vaguely similar to a scaled-down Jaguar XK120. In fact, a lot of people refer to the TR2, TR3 as the poor man's Jag. And with its raked windscreen, an egg crate grille inset deeply into the nose, and close-set upright headlamps, the TR2 clearly projected a singular purpose: sporty top-down driving. Now, in 1955, the little car was slightly modified and it was rebadged as the TR3. The most notable changes were bigger twin SU carburetors. The front grille was now less recessed in the nose for a cleaner appearance. It was really deep before on the TR2. And an optional rear jump seat was made available for the occasional passenger. In 1956, the cylinder head got better porting and the brake system was changed from Lockheed components to Girling with a new master cylinder and front disc brakes, which was pretty snazzy for the time. 1958 saw the introduction of the TR3A with the addition of a much wider pressed aluminum grille. It was pretty much full length across the nose, and parking lamps integrated into the grille and exterior door handles on the car. The TR3B was the final iteration of the model, specifically made for the U.S. market and fitted with a 2200cc engine and a fully synchronized gearbox, but they didn't make many of them because of the arrival of the all-new TR4. Inside these cars, the cockpit is snug, but it's plush, with standard vinyl or optional leather covering the dashboard, the door panels, and the seats. The stubby shifter has a short throw and your hands fall onto the stylish banjo steering wheel at a comfortable angle. The column isn't adjustable, but you sit just right in the car. And the doors are actually cut down low enough for you to reach down and touch the pavement. Maybe pick up a $10 bill that somebody dropped in a parking lot. There's a fairly spacious trunk with spare tire storage in a separate compartment below the trunk, and factory fiberglass hardtops were available at the time if you needed a little more shelter than a soft top, and you can still find one for sale online here and there. The TR2 and TR3 series of cars were capable of 100 miles per hour right out of the box, and they have been a favorite platform for club racing for many years. Skinny tires make spirited driving exciting after all. They're lightweight and fairly nimble, even with that live rear axle, although the limits of rear suspension travel can cause the inside rear wheel to lift in a corner, and that'll induce oversteer and then a spin out. But pound for pound and dollar for dollar, they were a great buy back in the 50s, more powerful than an MGA and far less expensive than a Jaguar, but just as stylish. So in today's market, to give you an idea of what you get for your money, let's talk about a few price points and compare them to other British sports cars of the era. Expect to pay no less than $7,000 for a running, driving TR2 or TR3. But understand it'll probably come with a long list of needs. It'll have mismatched paint, deteriorated rubber seals, oil leaks, hydraulic issues in the braking system, worn interior, and so forth. For $12,000 to $15,000, which is the next price point up, really, you can get a much better car that'll still need some sorting, but it should be mostly cosmetic stuff. Mechanically, it should be good for that money. And that's about the same price as a decent Austin Healey Bug-Eye Sprite, although it's a much smaller car with an engine less than half the size of the TR3 and not as refined. So at the next price point, which is $22,000 to $25,000, you can get a very nice example with documentation, no rust, and correct interior and color combination. You'd pay about the same for an MGA in similar condition. And at that price point with those two cars, really it's very subjective. It's just a matter of which one you like better. And another note, at $22,000 to $25,000, you're likely to find a TR2 or TR3 with, let's say, appropriate mechanical modifications that improve the driving experience and reliability without hurting the value. Remember, a lot of the owners of these cars, they're longtime owners. They're very passionate about them. They've sought to improve the driving experience without harming the character of the car. All right, the next price point is really not realistic for a budget collection, but I'm going to tell you about it anyway. Excellent TR2s and TR3s sell in the range of $30,000 to $50,000, which could also buy you a nice Austin Healey 100 or a bigger Austin Healey 3000. The 100 being a 4-cylinder and the 3000 being a 6-cylinder. And I would say the best TR3 in the world is probably worth $75,000 at most. And at that price point in today's market, you could buy a very solid Jaguar XK120 open 2-seater. Since so many TR2s and TR3s were raced, you should look carefully for all the little telltales of track time. Things like metal repair and panel replacement and body filler, engine modifications, things like braided fuel lines, missing bumpers because you strip those off because it's lighter, right? Missing carpet, flat black paint, stripped out interiors, worn suspension, and of course, holes where the roll bar was bolted in. All good signs that someone at some time raced that car. Rust is a problem in the battery box, the chassis rails, floors, trunk, doors, wheel arches, and rocker panels. And probably a few other places too. But if you can see it from the outside, it's much worse on the inside. So stay away from a rusty car. I mean, that's true of any of them, right? The Lucas electrical systems in British cars get a bad rap, but it's not entirely deserved. Lucas made excellent switches and lamps and junction boxes and voltage regulators and so forth, and the standard color coding system for wiring was used across the British car industry, and that made it easy to trace circuits. It's actually a very good system. The original wiring looms on TR2s and TR3s are also simple. They only have 2 fuses. But the real reason Lucas Electrics have a bad reputation is because these cars aged and then they went through a succession of owners. They didn't get proper care. Authorized service garages for British cars were limited mostly to big cities, so repairs were often just make do. American mechanics weren't familiar with the British electrical systems, and they often didn't have access to wiring diagrams. What you really wanted was an English-born mechanic. That was your best option, if you could find one. But good luck with that in Iowa or lower Alabama. Also, the British motor industry kept using positive ground long after most manufacturers had switched to negative ground. So then, of course, people would connect the battery backwards and fry the wiring. It was also very common for the wiring harnesses to get hacked up by people adding accessories and splicing things in and using the wrong color wiring. And then finally, the bullet-style connectors that British cars used became cold-welded together, and they're easily broken unless you carefully soak them in a penetrating solvent and work them apart bit by bit. It might take you a couple hours, going back and forth and just fiddling with it. Above all, unless you are very skilled in everything from engine building to metal fabrication and automotive painting, stay away from a TR2 or TR3 project car. Most of them are really just parts cars, and it's not worth investing in a basket case because there are plenty of good drivers out there. The Vintage Triumph Register is an active club of 70 chapters and about 2,800 members in North America, and they serve owners of the full range of classic Triumph cars. You can maintain a TR2 or TR3 with basic tools and the help of a few good repair manuals. And standard SAE wrenches and sockets will work. They didn't use any Whitworth hardware. And good original replacement parts are available here and there, but they may need some rebuilding or freshening. They're going to be used, but they're quality. Reproduction parts are plentiful, but stay away from cheap Chinese parts. Buy better quality and avoid that hassle. All that said, there are occasional deals out there. The barn find cars do exist. So if you find a clean TR2 or TR3 and you put some sweat equity into it, you'll have a fun, classic sports car in the best British tradition. Next up on the wish list, I think we need a big American luxury car. A land yacht that floats down the road, that you can steer with one finger because it has a power steering pump as big as a Briggs & Stratton lawnmower engine, and you can carry 4 or 5 of your best friends in plush comfort. So put aside the miserable fuel economy, we won't even talk about the numbers, and just embrace the country club vibes. My pick for an American luxury car is the 1969 through 1971 Lincoln Continental Mark III. But first, I have to take you back into some history. In the mid-1950s, a new segment emerged in the American car industry, the personal luxury car. It began with the Continental Mark II, an elegant two-door coupe loaded with amenities like air conditioning, power windows, and a sumptuous leather interior. The Mark II's styling paid tribute to the ultra-exclusive Lincoln Continental of 1939, a car that was the brainchild of Edsel Ford, and it was inspired by the opulent coach-built cars he'd seen during a trip to the European continent. So the 1956 Mark II was very much a reincarnation of Edsel's original idea back in the 30s. And if you compare photos of the 39 Continental and the 56 Mark II, you'll immediately see the family resemblance. The Mark II had a long front end with Frenched headlamps, an egg crate grille, which is always elegant, slab sides, and minimalist exterior trim. The hardtop was flattened with gently rounded corners and a wide sail panel to give the rear seating a sense of secluded luxury. And the signature trunk lid incorporated a hump under which the spare tire was nested. Not at all practical, but I guess it gave it an air of filthy old money. Continental was positioned as its own standalone brand, apart from Lincoln, And the goal was to build the finest car possible, competing with the best from Rolls-Royce, Bentley, and Mercedes-Benz. The Mark II was largely hand-built, and it carried a sticker price of $10,000 in 1956, which was more than twice the average annual income in the United States and almost as expensive as a new house. Because of slow sales, the Mark II only lasted for 2 model years, and Continental ceased to exist as a separate division. But the personal luxury car concept survived, with examples like the 4-seat Ford Thunderbird in 1958, the so-called Square Birds, the Buick Riviera in 1963, the Imperial Crown Coupe from Chrysler in 1964, and the Oldsmobile Toronado and Cadillac Eldorado coupes in 1966 and 1967. But my pick for this fantasy car collection is, as I said, the Lincoln Mark III. Now, it was a revival of the Mark II in many ways. It was a big luxury coupe with similar styling cues, but updated for a new era. The Mark III competed directly with the Eldorado and Toronado, which were both on the same front-wheel drive platform. The Mark III was spearheaded by Ford Vice President Lee Iacocca, the man behind the Mustang. He had a great sense for special products that had an emotional appeal to buyers. At the time, the Lincoln and Mercury brands were consolidated in Ford's dealership network. That is to say, they were sold under the same roof. And Iacocca decided that Lincoln could use a new personal car in their lineup to fill a market gap. He saw that the Thunderbird was actually stealing customers from Lincoln, and design studies began in 1965 with the objective of basically creating a Thunderbird for Lincoln buyers who had kind of wandered off. The 4-seat Thunderbird was selling well, and it had taken many buyers away since there wasn't a 2-door coupe option in the lineup from 1961 to 1965. But once the T-Bird became a 4-door with questionable styling, to say the least, in 1967, I think they're actually plug ugly, sales of the T-Bird took a hit. Lincoln finally did produce a 2-door for the 66 model year, but Iacocca's personal luxury car project was actually a parallel effort. In fact, it was really kind of a secret skunkworks project. Iacocca had a lot of pull inside Ford after the spectacular success of the Mustang, but there was some resentment of that within the various divisions and departments, and that included Lincoln. Anyway, this skunkworks, which they actually called the Strawberry Studio. Okay, I got to tell you about this. So Iacocca liked to take multiple teams and kind of set them against each other in competition. It was friendly, healthy competition, but he had 3 studios, and they were nicknamed Vanilla, Chocolate, and then this one was Strawberry, right? Because you want different flavors. So anyway, in the Strawberry Studio, they're working on this super secret car, which they codenamed the Launcelot, as in Sir Launcelot out of the Arthurian legends. And they used a Thunderbird platform as the basis for their dimensions. Early styling exercises and the full-scale mock-ups were a blend of Lincoln and Mercury design cues, but with unique touches here and there. So picture slab sides with front fenders that projected outward to a point, and a sharp crease along the top of the fender that extended rearward the full length of the body. The front grille had a sort of beak-like shape. It came to a point, and the headlights were hidden behind styled panels. It had a long hood and a short rear deck and tall sides with a kick-up just behind the door's trailing edge, which made the roofline seem lower than it really was. That whole visual trick of a tall side and then that kick-up. But the design still wasn't exclusive enough, at least not for Iacocca. But one night as he was laying in bed, he had an idea that eventually solidified the styling direction, and it would ultimately influence the look of Lincoln for the next 30 years. He envisioned an upright grille suggestive of the radiator shell on a Rolls-Royce. His exact words on the late-night phone call to styling chief Gene Bordenat were supposedly, "Put a Rolls-Royce grille on a Thunderbird." And that grille gave the Launcelot an exclusivity and elegance it needed to separate it from the overall styling direction of Lincoln and Mercury. According to the project's chief stylist, Dave Ash, Iacocca also directed his team to add a spare tire hump to the trunk as a nod to the earlier Mark II. The covered headlamps stayed, they liked that idea, and the wheel arches were flared out a little bit and they got a French curve, with the rear arches cutting slightly lower, just obscuring the top of the tires. It was an effective hint at the graceful fenders of the coach build era. Think Delahaye or Fagoni and Fulosky. Now, once the design came together, it was revealed to Henry Ford II, and when he saw it, he loved it. But the name Launcelot was eventually rejected in favor of Mark III, again at Iacocca's instruction, or so the story goes. In publicity photos for the launch, they posed the car alongside the 1939 Continental and the 1956 Continental Mark II. Ford saved tens of millions of dollars by building the Mark III on the Thunderbird platform, and the cars even shared the same roof. If you look at them carefully, you can see. Most Mark IIs had a padded vinyl roof, which was optional at first, but then it was made standard equipment. Under the hood was a 365 horsepower, 460 cubic inch V8, and if you spent the extra for the leather, what you would get was vat-dyed leather hides imported from Scotland, with color through and through. They just looked more expensive than American leather, and they were. The rear suspension was a 3-link setup with coil springs, and for braking, front discs and rear drums, including Ford's first anti-lock braking system called the SureTrack on the back brakes. The Continental Mark III was a big success for the Lincoln division, selling just over 79,000 units over the 3-year run. For a long time, these cars were not really appreciated as classics, but that has begun to change in recent years, and quickly. And although values are climbing, you can still get a nice example for not much money. There were minor changes with each model year, mostly due to federal regulations. And one big change was a heavier duty suspension for 1971, which cured a bit of the wallowing ride found in the earlier cars. Common rust areas on the Mark III are the chassis, the rocker panels, inside the rear wheel arches, and around the base of the vinyl top, where water tends to get trapped. The vacuum-operated headlamp cover system can be finicky, as well as the power window circuits. A well-kept interior is a huge win on these cars because of the elaborate, optional leather work, although, again, most had vinyl and cloth interior trim, and that held up well. But man, if you can find a leather car, get that. Prices start around $7,000 to $8,000 for a solid car with general wear and tear, and for $15,000 to $18,000, you'll buy a very presentable car in all respects. At the top end of the market, you would pay $30,000 to $45,000 for an immaculate low-mileage Mark III with impeccable ownership history and documentation. On BringATrailer.com, a metallic green car with 45,000 original miles sold recently for $34,000, and a gorgeous triple black 1970 Mark III brought $45,000 just a few years ago at Mecum. I think the best thing about these cars in general is that they don't have any of the chintz that crept into American luxury cars in the 1970s. They also still manage to look athletic and sharp, even despite their size. The Mark III is like a country club salon on wheels, to be honest, and nothing being built today is as comfortable. From American Luxo barges, we move on to German performance and a car that became a status symbol in the 1980s, the BMW E30. But it was much more than just a status symbol. When it arrived in North America in 1984, the all-new E30 instantly redefined concepts of performance and luxury, and that you can have both of them in one package without sacrificing much of either. The 3-box design language that began in 1962 had stayed fresh through multiple generations of BMWs. And it still incorporated classic cues like the so-called Hofmeister kink, which is a dogleg return at the base of the C-pillar and named after BMW design chief Wilhelm Hofmeister. The front fascia on the E30 was smoothed out, and it eliminated the snout-like appearance of the prior model, which was the E21. And the signature BMW twin kidney grills were shortened and widened, so the front end actually was much lower than prior cars. Inside the E30 was German modernism at its best, simplicity and functionality. And that's what redefined the idea of luxury, because it proved that you didn't need flourishes like gold-plated trim or walnut burl inserts or embossed filigree on the upholstery. Instead, you sat in firm, supportive seats with plenty of bolster. The steering wheel was the perfect diameter, it was well padded and easy to grip, and the faces of the precision VDO instruments in these BMWs were, in my opinion, the most legible in the industry, which meant that you only had to glance for a moment to see where the needle was pointing. And at night, they glowed in a fantastic red-orange light, as if you were on the bridge of a submarine or in the cockpit of a fighter plane. I've always loved that about BMWs. The dashboard control center for air conditioning and the radio were angled towards the driver, a feature that first appeared on the E21, but was refined on the E30. So again, it was just a quick glance to find what you needed and flip a switch. Even the climate control vents on these cars look expensive because BMW used a thick, high-quality molded plastic. And meanwhile, on even expensive American cars, the vents were made of thin plastic that would flex and even snap if you weren't careful. Under the hood, BMW's rock-solid inline-six engines were race-proven, smooth, powerful, and the company firmly rejected forced induction on their production cars at that time. And the Getrag 5-speed gearbox was strong and it was buttery to shift, but it still had the feel of positive engagement that made you confident with every gear change. The clutch was light, the brakes were what I would call authoritative, the steering was neutral, and the suspension was sure-footed and utterly stable. At about 2,500 pounds, the E30 couldn't be called heavy, and yet it pulled off a great trick. Its build quality and highway manners made it feel like a much heavier car, but when you wanted to wring it out, it felt much lighter. There's a reason BMW's marketing department called it the ultimate driving machine. There was real truth to that. So I mentioned the six-cylinder, but worldwide they even put four-cylinder 1.6-liter engines in these cars. But in North America, there were only a couple options for buyers at first. The four-cylinder 318i or the six-cylinder 325i. In 1986, BMW introduced the M3, which was built as a homologation special to qualify for racing in Group A of the German Touring Car Championship. They were only required to build 5,000, but the car was in such demand that 17,000 were made, including 786 cabriolet versions. The E30 had a couple of facelifts, most notably in 1987, which included a revised air dam, slight changes to the front end, and also larger taillights. And then the cabriolet model arrived that same year. It was the first full cabriolet for BMW since 1971. In 1991, the final model year for the E30 in North America, the brand had seen tremendous growth and widespread consumer recognition. And in 1994, BMW opened a stateside factory in Spartanburg, South Carolina. It's a tremendous success story when you consider that in the 1970s, most Americans had never seen a BMW, and they often thought it stood for British Motor Works, which was, I guess, the only B they could think of on a map. The current market for these cars is great for buyers. 2 million were produced, so surviving E30s are still plentiful, and if you shop around, you can find them in good condition for as low as $4,000. For that money, you should expect things like high mileage, peeling clear coat on the paint, interior wear, and a few door dings. In most cases, there will be electronic service records available through Carfax or the BMW dealer network. Now, a very solid E30 might only set you back about $10,000, and in some cases, it will have under 100,000 miles. Between $18,000 and $25,000, you can find a low-mileage, well-kept car with almost no needs. As you might expect, cabriolets generally command higher prices than coupes, and a 325i is worth more than a comparable 318i. Now, one more thing about the M3. It has become a halo car. So for our purposes, it's not an option. Even a project car will cost you nearly 20 grand. I think engines are going for 10 to 15. So we won't even consider that model. But there are two more models I haven't mentioned. And one is the 325iX, which is an all-wheel drive, and the E30 Touring, which is a wagon. And they actually also made an E30iX Touring. Because of the added complexity of the four-wheel drive system, the 325iX can be a money pit if you're not careful. And as for the Touring, it was never officially imported to the US, but a fair number have been brought in since they're now legal under the rolling 25-year rule. It's a great option if you need the utility and also for the novelty factor. You won't see many of them, but they also carry a premium for those same reasons, and also because Euro models are always cooler, so therefore always a premium. Common areas of rust on the E30 are around the rear license plate cove, at the door bottoms, at the base of the windscreen, and behind the tail lamps. You actually have to pull the lens and or the interior bulb service cover that you access from inside the trunk. All right, let's talk about the engines. The timing belt on the 6-cylinder M20 engine has a maximum service life of 60,000 miles. So documentation is critical to have on hand because this is an interference engine and a broken timing belt will destroy the valve train. The S14 4-cylinder is known as a sturdy workhorse, not a lot of problems with those. But that's less true of the later M42 4-cylinder found in late 318i's. However, all of these engines have a good record for longevity provided they've been maintained, especially the 6-cylinder. It will do high miles. Oil leaks are now common to all of them, but after all, they're 30 years old, so that is to be expected. And if you're inspecting a car, also look for tuner parts and engine swaps. It's common to find a later, more powerful engine in the E30, and that can be a good thing. And if it does have a more powerful engine swap in it, the seller is going to tell you about it. For them, it's a selling point. But for you, it might not be, because you never quite know the level of workmanship. And a good rule of thumb is to stay away from modified cars if they don't have any documentation of those changes. Any rubber parts, bushings, weather seals, hoses, axle boots, gaskets should definitely be inspected for wear or deterioration. German rubber is very good, but again, it's just a matter of age. Electric window switches are known to be a little bit fragile, and speedometers are prone to failure due to a plastic gear inside. That's all repairable. And parts availability is generally good for the E30, but there are occasional shortages of certain components. The BMW Car Club of America provides great member support and has an excellent monthly magazine known as the Roundel, which is a reference to the BMW badge. To sum it up, the E30 is a modern classic, and it's the last of the true 3-box BMW designs. It's not bloated like the later 3 Series models, and it will do everything you could possibly ask of it, from autocross to long-distance road trips. And in the marketplace, there's still lots of room for the nice ones to appreciate in value. So it's an emerging classic. So there you go, 4 cars of a virtual car collection, and they all fulfill a different purpose. So I hope you enjoyed it, but what would be in your virtual car collection? I'm sure some of you are sitting there shouting at me because I overlooked something, and that's the beauty of this, right? We all have our personal tastes. So tell me what would be in your virtual car collection. Give me a shout out on Instagram at Horsepower Heritage, or you can also go to the website, horsepowerheritage.com. Click on the contact button on the top right and shoot me a line. Well, that does it for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. If you enjoy the show, leave me 5 stars and a review, and you can support the podcast with a donation at buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage. And there'll be a link in the show notes. Just click on that, and couldn't be easier. You can also find Horsepower Heritage on YouTube. Plenty of good videos over there. And I'll see you back here on Wednesday, April 2nd, for more of the people and stories behind the machines. So until then, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.